see better the deeper riches of the major theological ideas of the New Testament. In addition, this approach to the New Testament has helped me to appreciate better the role of believers and the mission of the Church within the redemptive historical storyline of Scripture. It is my hope that the biblical theological perspective of this book will provide greater fuel to fire the Church's motivation to understand itself in the light of this stage of redemptive history and to fulfill its mission to the world. GKB. 1. Introduction. Of the writing of New Testament theologies, there seems to be no end. When I teach a class on New Testament theology, I distribute a 3-page bibliography of only New Testament theologies, the majority of which were written in the 20th century. My attempt in this book is not to write a New Testament theology, but rather a New Testament biblical theology. To some ears, this may not sound like much of a distinction. Nevertheless, this introductory chapter and the following body of this book will indicate how different my project is from that of the typical New Testament theology genre. The principles and definition of a biblical theology of the New Testament. The first task is to describe the particular discipline of New Testament biblical theology to be adopted in this book, which overlaps to some degree not only with whole Bible biblical theologies, but also with Old Testament biblical theologies. The increasing focus will be on the unique aspects of doing New Testament biblical theology. Some parts of this description will overlap with the task of the New Testament theology genre, but the differences will increasingly become apparent. First, many New Testament theologies spend much time discussing the question of the historical Jesus and whether a theology of the New Testament can begin with the life and teachings of Jesus. Some scholars conclude negatively about this, for example, Rudolf Bultmann, whereas more conservative writers base the beginning of their theologies on Jesus as he was portrayed in the Gospels. I will not spend time analyzing this issue, but I will assume the conclusion of conservative scholars, including conservative New Testament theologians, who decide that the Gospels portray a historically reliable picture of Jesus' ministry and thus start their study of the New Testament on that basis. Second, more recent New Testament theologies directly address the issue of postmodern hermeneutics, especially with respect to whether it is possible to interpret scriptural texts without one's theological biases detrimentally affecting the interpretations. This book will not address this issue, but a few comments are appropriate here. In the 20th century, both liberal historical critics and many conservative scholars believed that readers could interpret texts objectively, without their own presuppositions influencing their interpretations. Few, whether conservative or liberal, hold this view today, though some still do. The question now is whether one's presuppositions result in distorting the original meaning of a text and whether interpreters come away only with interpretive conclusions that reflect their own theological predispositions. Entire books can be and have been written on this issue. My assumption in this book is that all interpreters have presuppositions, and that some presuppositions are bad and distort the originally intended meanings of ancient texts, while other presuppositions are good and actually guide one into the truth of texts. The presuppositions of the biblical writers themselves, as expressed in Scripture, have the power through the Spirit to regrind the presuppositional lenses of its readers. One such presupposition, for example, is that the Protestant canon of the Old Testament and the New Testament composes the divinely inspired authoritative material for doing biblical theology. This differs from some who do not want to limit New Testament theology to this database and want to include the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, and other early Jewish works as part of the authoritative framework. Although these extra-canonical sources do need to be considered in the interpretation of New Testament texts, I will assume that they are not on the same authoritative level as those texts. I will make the same assumption about the Septuagint in relation to the Old Testament Hebrew text, the latter of which I take to be authoritative. Of course, there could be much discussion.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.